today I want to talk to you a little bit about backyard composting and some of the things that we can do to, if we do have food waste, go ahead and use it in a different manner that will help us hopefully grow more food, because that's a lot of majority of what we use composting for, is to give back nutrients and things that we have lost in the growing season back into our gardens and container gardens and stuff like that. And I'll talk a little bit about just regular backyard composting and a little bit on vermicomposting, which is composting with worms, which is kind of a goofy hobby, but you can really get into it. We are a club and we love it. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So composting really does help the environment. Yard waste use up such valuable space in our landfills. Our landfill space is disappearing every year. Organic materials, 2006 survey done by the EPA, organic materials were making up over 65% of the trash that was going in there. So April to October every year, yard waste was accounting for more than half of collected refuse in major cities. In Indiana, we've recognized that early, and since 1994, we technically haven't been able to put yard waste into Indiana landfills. Certain recycling programs, certain county waste management will take yard waste refuge, but they're doing something with it besides putting it into the actual landfill itself. So what could we do? You could burn it, but that's pointless. It's high moisture content. Burning's impractical. Plus, you can't really do open burning of leaves and trash in Indiana. If you're in a rural area, we just don't tell. But I know farmers, they burn leaves and stuff off their field, but technically homeowners were not supposed to be doing any of that. So by using a natural method, composting, you're really helping the environment in a very large way, but also generating something that you can use to save money and be more organic and environmentally friendly. So what can be composted? Any plant material. So whether that was a fruit, a vegetable, leaf, grass, straw, anything that was a plant material can be composted. So yard waste, leaves, weeds, remainder of garden plants, they all make excellent compost, and I'll touch on disease issues in a minute because that's a big question I get. Woody plant materials, so like small sticks and twigs, shavings, maybe from a dog pen or an animal pen, they decompose much slowly, and they're better used for maybe ground, chipped, or mulch. You can use them for mulch. They work great. Grass clippings can be composted. I know people that are very passionate about getting grass clippings off the lawn, but to be honest, you grew that grass, the nutrients, it'll break back down very quickly. It'll put nutrients back into your soil. So when people ask if they should bag grass clippings, I'm like, no, just leave it where it lie. Sawdust, raw fruit, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, eggshells, all of those can be included in your compost pile. So what is happening in the compost pile is basically we're breaking things down. It's really a smorgasbord, a feeding frenzy of bacteria, fungi, the microbial decomposers. They're the very first things that start to feed on that plant material. They break it down. It produces heat. It's a heat producing process. It can be anaerobic or aerobic, which means it requires oxygen or it doesn't. It can occur under either environment, but aerobic is definitely the way to go because it is a faster breakdown, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's important coming up. So fungi, other one-celled organisms, they soon join in. Then you're going to get insects, worms, and others. And if you're composting your pile correctly, with a few guidelines, that's where it's going to stop. You're not going to end up with critters. I have people that worry about, dogs or cats or raccoons, skunks, mink, all those crazy things that we have in backyards in Indiana. They really aren't attracted to this if you're doing things correctly. And once people start it, I have had very few people come back and say, hey, I had this issue and how do I correct it? So here's just a different look at the compost food web. So there's a level 1, level 2, and level 3, so you can really get into the biological sciences of this breakdown, but bacteria and fungi, they are our friends in the sense of composting, not in the sense of food waste. But mites, springtails are level 2s, and then we really get into some beetles and centipedes and different types of bugs there for level 3. On a biochemistry type level, we're really breaking down the complex carbohydrates, all those crazy organic chemistry chains that get put together to make any certain vegetable or plant material. You're breaking those back down to the simple sugars and the organic acids, and sometimes people can refer to that as, humus. And it really becomes unrecognizable from its plant or its start parent material. So we're just breaking it all down back into its natural form. So another big part of the biology, and this is something that you kind of have to note because you're going to be manipulating this to make your compost pile most effective. Every plant material is carbon and nitrogen. Even humans, we are a certain specific type of carbon and nitrogen ratio. When feeding, these microbes are converting carbon into energy and nitrogen into protein. Now the protein sometimes they use and they'll put it back, but these are the building blocks for all things on Earth is basically carbon and nitrogen. So you need a good balance. You don't want too much carbon, you don't want too much nitrogen because they need to work in concert to make sure everything breaks down most effectively. So that ideal balance is 30 to 1. In other words, 30 parts of carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So I know that that's very scientific, but there's another way that I like to break this down that people really enjoy, and that's called browns. And that's the carbon materials, and then the nitrogen materials we call greens. So browns are high carbon materials. So these are going to be things like leaves, straw, paper, which you might think is a weird thing to compost, but how many of you guys would like to compost your bills and never see them again? It works. Sawdust, animal bedding mixed with manure, we're going to go ahead and call that a brown. If it was just straight manure, like you were cleaning out some sort of animal barn, it would be considered a green. But if it's got any sort of bedding mixed into it, you're going to be using it as a brown. So those are all the different type of ratios. So you can see there's a wide variety. Paper and straw having the most. Sawdust, depending on how finely it's ground or what type of sawdust it is, pine versus hardwood can be very, very carbon heavy. But greens, there are those high nitrogen materials. These are the things that break down very quickly in a normal environment. So if they're out exposed to heat and light, wet. So vegetable scraps, they're going to be considered a green material. Coffee grounds, grass clippings, and certain types of straight manure. So depending on the animal's digestive system, hogs, they're monogastric, much like humans are, so they utilize feed just kind of the same way we do. They have a very low ratio for carbon and nitrogen, so it's kind of what we call a hot manure, so to speak, where cows and horses are going to be on the higher end. They can break down plant material. They have the ability to ruminate and send things back through the digestive cycle, so they're going to have things with a higher carbon ratio to them. So another way to think about this side by side is browns very slowly, greens very rapidly. Coarse browns, they can keep the pile aerated, which is very important. Greens, if you have too much of them, it all just kind of collapses down and gets into a mucky, foul odor type mess. There's two issues with these that we need to try to adapt to when we're making compost at home is typically we have more browns in the fall and more greens in the spring and summer. So storing one or the other until you accumulate the necessary part of the ratio of both can be kind of interesting. So the reason that we care about this is browns, if you have too much brown, too much brown and not enough nitrogen, browns need nitrogen to decompose. So they're going to tie up soil nitrogen, which should be available to our plants to help fully decompose. So that's why you want the right ratio, because you want the nutrients available to your plants or your grass or whatever it is you're putting this back to available. You don't want that to continue to decompose once you get it where you want it. So this ratio becomes important when talking about nutrient availability. So this is another chart that I have that just goes through carbon and nitrogen ratios. And this kind of goes from small to large, so things that have a very low ratio to a very high ratio. There are certain things that you never want to compost, anything of a black walnut tree. And if we had him, I'll test Valerie. Valerie, why do we not compost black walnut trees?
Juglone.
Yes, juggalo. It is a substance that can harm some garden plants. If you're a landscaper at all, you know that certain plants, shrubs, annuals are very susceptible to this toxicity and cannot be planted anywhere near a black walnut tree. Most garden plants, vegetable gardens, cannot be planted near a black walnut because they won't grow well. Foods, there are certain foods that you don't want in your compost pile. Fish, meat, bones, dairy products. Breads, I can kind of get away with. It's one of those things in limitation you can put in, but fatty or greasy things, oils, they can't break these down. So they could, if they get into a high enough amount, can attract some insects or rodents, but some bacteria can't break those down, so they're going to hang around longer. Wood ash. Historically, I've learned from a lot of people that they call it, they'll call things sweet or sour, and they really mean acidic or alkaline. But a lot of people not a lot, but there are some people that are under the impression that you have to add wood ash to make it a more neutral entity. And that's not necessarily the case. Compost naturally goes to an acidic point of around 6 to 6.5, which most landscape plants, that's ideal. So you're not going to need to bring that back by adding wood ash. But also you're not going to have to lime it, because I've seen people go the other way and they want to add lime, and that's not necessarily good either. So one of the guiding principles for compost piles to get them to degrade and break down quickly is surface area. The smaller an item is ground or chopped, the greater its surface area. Okay, so that is more space for those microbes to feed. So think of it as you're opening up more chairs for that buffet. All right, the more microbes that are feeding, the faster it breaks down. So if you have the ability to kind of grind or chop compost materials, it really will speed that up. We kind of give a rule of thumb of about 2 inches. Rule of thumb, a variety of sizes are kind of needed, though, to make sure that you have good aeration. So some of those coarse browns, those heavier mulches or sticks, are good because they allow oxygen to get to the middle of the pile. So how do you start a compost pile? First, you're going to want to remove any grass or sod that may be available where you're going to want to put this placed. Why do we want that? You want to have access to the microbes you want. They're all in the soil. You have to have that access to soil. Eventually it'll be okay, but they may not move into your compost pile quickly, and you may have a mess. So you'll want to make sure that that has direct contact with soil. Most compost piles are going to be a 3x3, 5x5. I think the 3x3 in the years I've been doing this is a little small, so that's why I kind of adapted it to the 5x5. We can still have some very cooler weather for composting in the winter, and that 5x5 gets us by a little bit more. You can start layering that compost material. So you'll put a load of greens, you'll put a load of browns, a load of greens, a load of browns. You'll bury your vegetable waste in there. You're going to want to wet the mixture. They do need water. They need that. And you can sprinkle a cup of dry fertilizer. And people's like, why? I'm making fertilizer. Why do you want to do that? It just works as a catalyst to get that decomposition process down. So, I mean, it's just a cup, just a small little cup of fertilizer will start that to get that process kicked off. And you'll either come and cover your compost pile. You can cover it with material or other soil, add it back, and you can just repeat that process until you have the size that you desire. And the whole point of a compost pile is to break it down. So just note that that pile size will shrink, so you need to have the ability to add to it. So again, this is 27 cubic feet, 3x3, 3 feet high, 3 feet wide, 3 feet long. This size will insulate the pile's heat and ensure that microbial activities continue. So in cooler weather, bacteria doesn't like to work. They like to work in warmer weather. Heat is a byproduct of decomposition, so it will continue to grow. But on cooler or cold days, say we have a cold rain, your compost pile is going to kind of decrease in activity. So you want to have enough size that there's still heat in the middle so that microbial activity will continue. Smaller piles, we call them that they'll quit or go dormant, especially in the fall through the winter if they can't insulate those temperatures. But larger piles may get to the point where they smother each other out. I mean, you can't get any oxygen in there because it's too much of a weight. You're not getting oxygen in there. So it is kind of a Goldilocks, just right type situation. Water and air becomes very important. So there is a little bit of management. Compost piles need to be checked every now and then to see if they need water. Here in the spring, water not normally an issue for your compost pile. In the summer, when we get to the July and August, as you're watering landscape plants, you might throw the hose over to the compost pile to make sure that it's still active. The way that you can determine if it's too wet or too dry, you can just scoop up a handful of that and squeeze it. If water runs out, it's too wet. If it's, nothing's running out or it's dusty, it needs some water. So you kind of want to be the consistency of a damp sponge. Turning the pile, aerating the pile with a pitchfork or machinery or equipment, or if you have the ability to turn a bin, if that's what you've chose to use, you're ensuring that that water gets evenly distributed, but you're also making sure that oxygen gets distributed, so you're keeping that pile alive and going. So this is, achieving aeration is actually a very scientific principle of making sure that this is an aerobic process. So you can see here on the left, there's turning frequencies. So on the vertical axis, we look at temperature. On the horizontal axis, we look to days to decomposition. So how fast will that pile decompose? Well, you can see if you're turning that pile every 3 days, we reach 160 degrees very quickly. So that oxygen means you have quite a bit of bacteria going. They're off producing that heat, and that 160 degrees becomes quickly. You want 160 degrees. That's what breaks down weed seeds, it breaks down diseases, and it almost sterilizes the pile. So you want a pile temp that's warm. And when you put your hand in it, you'll feel it. That is warm. If you're not so industrious with every 3 days, you can see this middle black line's every 10 days and every 30 days. So if you're only turning it every 30 days, you're only going to get to maybe 120 degrees. And it's just going to take a lot longer for that to decompose. But every 3 days, you can see that it'll come back down here to about 80 and hold. And that basically means you're pretty much done. So that's a pretty quick decomposition process. So aerobic is up to 90% faster. So that's what makes composting work. You have to make it an aerobic process. It'll work. I mean, say you go out and you forget about it, it's fine. You're not going to kill it and have to start over, but you're just going to want to make sure that you turn it. Anaerobic odor emissions. Anaerobic processes, decomposition processes, where you get odor. So you want to make sure that it's aerobic because you just don't want the odor. So you'll notice a nitrogen, ammonia type smell if you're not turning it enough. So you can check your compost pile with your hand. You can check it with a compost thermometer. It's not a whole lot different than something that's in your kitchen. It's not a high-tech device or anything, but it's very important that it'll get that harmful bacteria, weed seed, and pest control. So we really want that 160 degrees. You can use your hand to kind of tell where you're at if you don't have a thermometer. If it's too cold, the pile's not working. If it's too hot for your hand, again, the pile's not working. Maybe to potentially need to cool it down a little bit, maybe aerate a little more or less, get some more browns in there as well. I'm going to keep this pretty quick through this section. I do this teaching in a lot of urban areas, so I just always want neighbors to be neighborly because I hate being on the area plan commission and hearing about this from a nuisance issue. Shaded areas will help your compost pile keep from getting dried out in the summer, but in the wintertime it's not so great. But you're not going to want to put your compost in pile that's going to interfere with lawn and garden activities. They're not necessarily the most sightly things, So, you know, in an area, you're going to need to be able to work around it, but you do want it in an area that you don't have to chuck it all the way across your property to get it where you need it. So I like to encourage people to incorporate some sort of compost area, you know, whether it be like near a work shed where you keep your tools, or near the garden areas where we keep ours, because that's where we use it directly. So it's just part of our garden. But you need water available. You don't want to have to be taking buckets of water to your compost pile. But make sure that you have, wow, it skipped. Make sure you have good drainage, that it's away from any wells. Be a good neighbor. Make sure it's some sort of attractive and keeping it out of your neighbor's view. So here's a couple of ways you might compost. This is just a regular mound. These type of bins are very popular because you can store, you can have one active unit, one part where you're storing a unit, maybe you have some finished in the other unit, and you can kind of hop between what you need. So these turning units are very popular. Worm composting bin. Cinder blocks. You can even go industrial and have a much larger cinder block turning unit. The snow fence can work, and it can also, you can paint this and make it a little bit more sightly to be around, but this will help kind of keep things a little bit more vertical and compacted and allow you to get oxygen in, turn it, but also then put it back to where it keeps heat. Pallets work a little bit, not as easy to work, you know, with pallets, because you can't really open them up like you can a snow fence, turn it over and put it back. Wire mesh bins. Garbage can composter, you want to make sure you have air holes in that, a drainage hole on the bottom in case it's too wet. So once you have that pile built, it's just going to take time. So it's just a thing that's going to work in the background. Hopefully your pile's been turned more than once a month, but those composted materials will start to decompose naturally. It can take as short as 2 months or as long as a year. It just depends on how active you are and what type of things you're composting in it. So a lot of people just want to know, well, when's it soup? When's it done? It'll continue to work till there's nothing left. A lot of times people are going to think they're just going to end up with this dark soil kind of down there in that picture. And unrealistic expectation, you're going to have some small fragments of things that you're going to notice, but most of your material is going to be something that you cannot recognize it when it was done. Whatever it was, it kind of looks like potting soil. There may be a few things added in that, oh, there's a wood chip, but it's to the point, it's done, and that's what you're going to do. There's some simple tests to do that. The bag test, you can put a seedling in it first, or put a seedling in it to see if it germinates. You can put it in a bag. If you don't have any odor, it's good to go. Most common problems for compost pests or issues is rotten odor. So maybe it's compaction. You just need to turn the pile because it's gone anaerobic. Maybe it's too much moisture, so you need to add some carbon to it. An ammonia type odor would be too much nitrogen, so you need to add some more carbon to it. Low pile temperature is the most common issue, so there's a variety of ways you can adjust that. I don't see too many issues with high temperature issues, but every now and then it just means turn your pile a little bit. And pest means that don't use meat scraps. So compost really improves soil structure. It's a great food source for earthworms. It adds nutrients to your soil. It can be used as a mulch, soil additive, lawn dressing, lots of different things. Just make sure that it's mature, that it has no rotten smell, because you don't want it to be pulling nutrients away, because it's going to continue to decompose when it's being used as an amendment. So a lot of times we're using compost in a way that we're trying to improve soil health. Now, whether that's improving water and nutrient retention, loosening compact clay soils, maybe just making our containers a better option for our flowers, which is how I use a majority of mine. I like to use compost. I like to use a little bit of potting mix and a little bit of topsoil or garden soil, whatever it is. So I kind of have all three that I'll use. You can use it as a lawn top dressing. I don't know anybody that's making enough to really, put it on their lawn as a top dress, but very much like using it as a potting mix. So this is kind of what it would looks like. You can produce a lot of compost and use it in a variety of manners. So this is a abandoned industrial site. This is all on concrete in the middle of downtown Chicago, Illinois. This is an outfit called Growing Power. I got to visit in one of my ag leadership groups. So they are growing fresh lettuce greens here, and you can see they have a couple of different plantings here, but this is all compost that they had produced on site. They're using a Vermine composting procedure and growing greens and selling it back both to the community as a goodwill gesture, but also selling it into certain high-end restaurants. So how do we do this process with worms? Well, it's a whole lot funner when you add worms because I can keep my toddler entertained. Of course, he still calls them snakes, but they are worms. And he's figured out you can take the tail off. But basically the process is just using earthworms and your normal microorganisms to convert all this. So vermicomposting composting can speed things up, and you can do it in a much smaller space than just a regular compost pile. So again, all the certain pros are there, you know, disposal cost, amendment. I always make the joke about the dinner grist. I keep my compost bin inside my kitchen. It fits underneath the cabinet. It's right there where I need it. I don't have any odors, but for a long time, my mother-in-law really wanted to know what I was up to. So that was kind of interesting for the first few years of my marriage. She's now a true believer, by the way. Just a couple of worm facts. They have mouths but no teeth. They are sensitive to light, so you need to make that a consideration. They can regenerate a new tail but not a new head, which is a fact I am regretting telling my toddler. But the end nearest to that white creamy band around the midsection is the head. So for a worm bin, you just need a bin with a lid. You'll need bedding, you'll need moisture. You need to make sure you keep it at proper temperature area, make sure it has ventilation and food. So we're going to go through that. They don't like light, they don't like vibrations, they don't like extreme temps. So you're going to need to keep it in somewhat of a quiet spot, somewhere between, you know, that 60, 75, maybe 80-degree range. They don't like it too hot or too cold. The size of the bin is going to depend on how much vegetable scraps or how much you're cooking, how much organic matter you plan to compost, but basically you can count on 1 square foot of surface for every pound of garbage. You don't have to have it any deeper than 15 inches. I like plastic Rubbermaid bins. You can build these for under 10 bucks. Just go to Walmart, get you an 18-gallon Rubbermaid bin, couple of holes, a plastic PVC pipe, and you can make this at home. You can style it, paint it, stickers, whatever you want to do. Worm amounts, you're going to need about a ratio of 2 to 1. So if you have a pound of worms for a 2 foot by 2 foot bin, you're going to get about 4 pounds a week of garbage in there. So you're going to need a pound of worms. And about an 18-gallon Rubbermaid bin, you're going to need 2 to 3 pounds of worms. Keep in mind that worms will reproduce. They thrive in this type of environment. So they will need to be divided every few months, which means you get to go add earthworms out in the garden. Not every earthworm, believe it or not, we have 11 types of earthworms in Indiana. You need to use red wiggler worms. Red wigglers are the ones that are specifically adapted to this environment. You can order those through Bait Shop. Vermicomposting composting has become such a mainstream thing now. You can order them through Amazon and they will show up in your mailbox. It's great. So pretty easy to get access to those. Worm bedding, a little bit of a different than your regular compost pile. It must hold moisture. It must be light, fluffy, and non-toxic. So basically what we're saying is shredded newspaper. I know a lot of people don't take shredded newspaper, you know, the newspaper at home anymore. But if you have the ability to get some scrap paper, you know, whether it's bills or you can't use anything that's a magazine or real slick and has a lot of the inks, but any business, if you're at work and you shred stuff and can get a hold of shredded newspaper, it works great. Some suggest you can add some peat moss to about a third, so 2/3 paper, 1/3 peat moss, and you'll want about 3 pounds per cubic foot, or if you just want to say 3/4 of the bin, that's what I go by. I just do it by eye. It works. You'll want it damp but not soggy. Use the same technique for how you do a regular compost pile. You're going to want to add a handful of soil for the same thing you added a handful of fertilizer to the outside pile. You just want to start this process and you want to inoculate it with all the bacterial and decomposers that you want. So go outside, get a handful of soil, toss it in the bin. Eggshells for calcium. So they do like calcium and you're going to need some eggshells in there, okay? They like to be left alone. When you feed them, you can assess your bin conditions, drain off that extra moisture. You can take finished compost out, add to house plants. If you need more bedding or more moisture, you can just keep a bag right there and add it as needed. I use a little spray bottle that I fill with water and keep right on top so I can spray it. You monitor for flies and control that quickly, which basically means stop feeding it for a little while, turn it, and they'll go away. So worm feeding any fruit and vegetable, okay? Don't use citrus, but plate scrapings, be careful. You don't want to have a whole lot of butter, salts, or syrups. Tea bags, the whole tea bag, the whole thing of coffee grounds, filter and all can go in there. Avoid your dairy meats and fats. I always joke that I have a Labrador for that issue, and it makes me his favorite because I feed him the leftover dairy meats and fat. So that's kind of my joke. Feed when convenient. You know, some people like to, if their bin's outside, they may have a small collection point next to their cooking area and they'll collect, you know, the tops of tomatoes or strawberry tops or the leftover celery or whatever. They may collect that for a few days and then take it outside and put it in their bin. I said mine's in my kitchen, so every time Keith's done, you know, cooking, I basically will scrape what I can and put it straight into the bin. But basically, so you'll have a bin, and normally when I do this presentation, I have an actual bin, but since we're on camera here, you'll have a bin, you'll have the bedding in it, it'll be wet, you'll have all the worms in here. So you'll basically dig a hole to one side, input your scraps, cover it back over with the paper, and let it be. Sometimes it's very, they love banana peels, watermelon rinds, cantaloupe rinds. These things will devour. It's their absolute favorite. These things will be gone in a couple of days. You won't be able to find it. Eggshells work great. If you leave it alone, eventually all that worm bedding is going to be converted. Again, you're going to have flecks of paper. You may have a fleck of eggshell or a little piece of banana peel or whatever you fed last. There may be pieces, but you can start to plan to harvest every couple of weeks. So basically, you'll move all the worms in the bedding to one side, add new bedding, you'll start feeding on that side. All the worms are going to migrate to where the food party is because everybody stands near the buffet at a party, right? So they're going to move to that side of the bin and you can harvest the compost out. If you take a few worms out, no big deal. These things are dividing, they're reproducing in there, so taking a few worms out is not going to hurt anything. Although, if you are putting these into house plants, you don't necessarily want worms in house plants because they'll end up on your floor and your cat has a great time, so just kind of be prepared to pull worms out if you're using them in your house. I didn't do that on purpose at all, but worms are a whole lot better than frog I found in my oxalis pot when I brought it back in from, I put it out last summer, I brought it in last winter, and we had a frog. So you can just do that, and you can kind of keep an ongoing compost pile there. So you can use it. I like to apply it directly to my plants. I'll put it in old chicken feed bags and just let it store in the barn. It's fine if it gets hot or cool or whatever. I don't seal the bag. I just kind of roll it up a little bit. It's applicable to air. And whenever I need that potting mixture, you know, a couple of weeks ago, I went and I grabbed a bag and a half, mixed up my pots, and it makes for great compost. I don't fertilize anything all summer long that way, so I kind of like it. If I put new transplants in, you know, like I have a couple of annuals that I like to get every year, so I'll put a little bit of the compost in the bottom near the root system when I plant it, and I'll just leave it. I don't worry about fertilizing it. So when I get hanging baskets, I like to put a little bit of compost on top, and I'll put mulch on top just to try to keep it moisture in it, because eventually I kill hanging baskets because I don't water them enough. But I like to add the compost because it's more nutrient dense than just the potting mix that most hanging baskets come in. So, so it's slightly more concentrated. The vermicomposting has more nutrients than your yard compost bins. So, but you can mix it and use it about anywhere. So I encourage you to go container crazy like this. This would be my ultimate patio if I had one. But all sorts of annuals, perennials, they like it. And this can be a very lucrative business if you're into this. So Growing Power in Chicago, Illinois, like I said, they were doing this and putting this on an industrial site. This is their vermicomposting bins. So you can see here, they have bags over the top to make sure that these aren't subjected to light, and the way that they filter those boxes can kind of come off and they'll feed in the bottom, or they'll make them move to the top and they can kind of shuffle those around when it's done. But they're selling that stuff for $100 a cubic yard. So compost in certain areas is very, very expensive. So, but good use for everybody. It's kind of a passion project. It makes you feel good. You can have fun. It's a nice science lesson for kids and adults. And if you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of me at any time. Happy composting.
Amanda.
Sure.
I do have a question. Is there a pub on the redworm composting that I can have like at a glance?
Yes. Purdue does have a vermicomposting with worms publication. North Carolina has a very great one that I like to pass out as well. And if you guys are going to put this up on your YouTube channel, I will send you the How to Make a Worm Bin Under $10 publication. I just have it as a picture, and I'll get that sent to you guys so you can add those links to your YouTube video.
I had a couple questions for you too, Amanda.
Shoot.
You're talking about some of those piles can get up to 160 degrees. So is there a recommendation of how far to keep a compost pile? Like, do you need to keep it a certain number of feet from a house, or have you read anything about that, or keeping it away from buildings or things that might be flammable, or is that usually not an issue?
Normally not an issue. So at our old place, we used to have it right up against the garage, which was wood siding, and it didn't worry me so much, that it was temperature. I haven't had any issues. I guess that'd be something to look up, but I don't know of any issues. I know my soil and water person in Warwick County, her compost pile is directly next to her, next to her animal barn, the horse stalls. So it's kind of like right there. So she even has it pretty close to animals even. So I don't think it's an issue, no, but I guess I can't really answer that question scientifically either.
Well, I get a lot of questions about it, and I've never really anything. So that's why I was like, well, I'll ask Amanda today. The other thing with the eggshells, do you normally crush those, or do you just put them in, like just
Nope.
half toss them in? Okay.
Yeah, whatever, they're cracked. We had a couple of hard-boiled eggs that we didn't eat that kind of got left in the back of the fridge. I just tossed the whole things in there. They were gone. So, yeah.
You hopped on. Did you have any
large things, like if you had an apple or apple cores, they're great. Throw the apple cores in there. Certain things like that are larger, that maybe it has a spot in it, nobody's going to eat it, you're going to toss it out. I may cut those up into fourths if you're going to put those in there, because again, surface area, feeding area is just going to allow them to break it down quicker, so you don't have an issue with odor. Watermelon rinds, I kind of cut pretty small when they go in there, but at least they don't have to go in my trash and stink.
Amy, did you have any questions? I saw you joined. Okay.
Hey, Amanda.
Hey.
I couldn't figure out how to unmute there. I'm working from home and doing this at the same time, so I'm kind of multitasking.
So am I.
Yeah. I'm on my real job, but right now too. I was wondering, I have chickens and ducks. Is
Mhm.
it okay to put their bedding in the compost pile?
Yeah,
Um,
I do.
okay.
So we have chickens and ducks at home. We clean out our coop about, okay, let's be realistic. Once every 3 months, we clean out the chicken coop.
Right.
But we like to use it. So if it's a certain type of year where I want mulch, like right now we just cleaned it out,
Mhm.
and I just go ahead and lay it down as mulch around my flower beds, around my blueberries, stuff like that, where
Okay.
if I'm laying it on the top part, I'm not laying it in the root zone, so it has an opportunity to decompose a little bit before it gets in. But yes, if we have excess that we don't need for mulch, or if it's the winter time,
Mhm.
that's a great addition to the compost pile. That's going to give you a little bit of greens. Um, that manure in there will decompose pretty quickly, and it'll get the browns that most of the time you have through the winter. It'll get them started pretty well. So we
Okay.
kind of use our shavings multi-use around here.
Sure. I was going to say, because right now I just kind of put the shavings like out in my garden around the stuff
Yeah.
and work it into the dirt and everything in the spring. So,
Yeah.
But in the wintertime, it's kind of like, what do you do with it?
Yeah, most of the time in the wintertime, we just go ahead and add it directly to the pile. But
Okay.
early spring, because we always do an early spring clean out before we get chicks, yeah, we typically put it around our fruit trees, which are fairly established.
Okay.
I don't put it around our garden plants. Garden plants can be very tender. Plus, you're dealing with a Salmonella, E. coli.
That's true.
So if I'm going to do it there, I'm going to make sure it goes through the full compost bin before I put it there.
Okay.
But to be honest, my husband and I don't really put anything in the ground anymore anyway. We use all straw bale gardening.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, I don't have to worry about it as much as I used to.
Sure.
But we put it around the berries, because they're on the bush. It's not touching anything at that point.
So on that, I guess I never really thought about that. I mean, I never put it like directly around the plants in the garden, but is it okay to work it into the ground early in the spring? When we do our first tilling, when it's tilled repeatedly before I start planting, does that hurt anything, or should I
Is
probably?
it fresh or is it composted at that point?
Pretty well fresh, yeah. I mean, it's
I would
mixed
do it
with
in the
like some
fall.
shavings.
If you could do that in the fall, incorporate a fall and allow it to decompose, you're going to be safe. Earlier in the spring, wet, oxygen, I can't say for scientific certainty that you wouldn't have an issue.
Okay. I've always kind of wondered about that. It kind of is kind of gross when you think about it.
Well, we do studies on this. So back when we had the real bad floods, and Valerie knows this, they've done some research there at the Southwest Purdue Ag Center regarding flooded vegetable fields. And, because when we have floods, we have a lot of septics in southern Indiana.
Sure.
So, what are we doing with? So we have some resources on that. So, I mean, it's not entirely out of the realm of some of the things. I mean, we looked at it,
Sure.
but found out that the risk was low in certain instances, especially if you were following good ag practices with handling and stuff like that. So.
Okay. All right. And then one other thing, what are your thoughts on these Pinteresty compost bins, where they show where you take like the 3 pallets and you have them 3-sided and you build the door and stuff? Is that okay to do? I mean,
I'm not on Pinterest because I have a full-time job and I know it would interfere with that.
I know.
But I haven't seen that. But you can get creative, and I see so many people get creative for their needs. I was just at a client's house the other day. They had the most amazing chicken run ever. So I added another thing to my honeydew list. But the biggest things are the size, the temperature.
Okay.
Can you get water to it? Because that's a big thing people forget. They're thinking, oh, it rains on it, it's fine. Well, in times of dryness, that doesn't work. And a lot of times in the fall, when we have the perfect temperature to be actively composting, we're short on moisture. So it's great for my farmers that need harvest, but for us in the landscape, we need to be watering well through. Sure. So as long as you can work it, add it, make it work for you. Okay. I wish ours was a little prettier, but I have 12 acres and I kind of the woods and yeah.
Yeah, we live out in the boonies, so it doesn't really have to be pretty, but I have access to pallets. So
Yeah.
I was going to think, build the 3-sided thing out of the pallets, be able to get in and be able to flip it and stuff. So
We kind of have ours, and I don't have the full concrete bin.
Mhm.
Our bin's only about 2 blocks high, but it just gives me that size reference I need
Okay.
to try to keep it at a manageable size.
Okay.
Because I like the 5x5 because just the way that the pitchfork goes in, I can kind of get the pile from that edge. And if I need to get to it from the back, I just toss it over the back of those. It's not high enough that I can't get to the back and flip it.
Great. Okay, great. You guys have been really informative today. I've appreciated it.
If you have any questions, just email Val, or my email's right there.
Sure.